And thank you so much for being here for a third time.
It's a pleasure.
We're all very excited to have you back and to learn more today, and looking forward to the day. To everybody else on the call, the regulars, welcome. Nice to see you. And I see a few newer faces, so welcome to you guys. At Worldview Academy, we love to bring people together to talk about interesting OD-related stuff. We're not too married about what happens. In the conversation, we have a theme, and we start with some ideas and some conversation. Today, Christo and Dominic's gonna have a conversation. And then we'll see how that goes. Please, if you have any questions at any point, type that into the chat box. Both me and Christo will keep an eye there. And there will be some time for more questions and conversations towards the end. So with that, Christo, I'm going to hand over to you guys.
Thank you, Liesl, and thank you, Dominic, for joining us again. I think it's becoming an interesting exploration, difficult at times. I was in preparation for this. I was thinking, like, what am I going to say? And hopefully not too much to actually let you do the talking.
I was thinking the same thing, so I don't know. I hope you have something to say.
Well, there's some things. There's some links that I want to make into this conversation. The first is our conversation today is developing ourselves and others as leaders. So there's a question about what's this leader thing, or what is leadership, and leadership as action in the domain of being. And what you also said in the previous talk is leadership is to bring actions in the right relation to the truth of being. Now, that's a whole mouthful. And then what we spoke about when we chat last week was practical implications for OD practitioners, because this is the space in which we work. It's the space of organization development, leadership development, leader development. And I must confess that, you know, once again, back to David Graeber, it feels like there's a whole lot of bullshit here. And last year I worked with a group of middle managers, and they were going through a retrenchment process. And in the middle of this, I had the shocking realization that it would actually be quite easy for the organization to let these middle managers go. Actually quite easy, because to a certain extent, there is a degree of, you know what David Graeber says, some jobs that you do that either won't make much of a difference if you stop doing it, or in some cases that the world would actually be slightly better place if you stop doing those jobs. So there's a whole piece of question around this creation of more and more bureaucratic roles that are it's the famous thing that Peter Drucker said of management, that the best thing you can do is just get out of the way of the people who are doing the work. So this in a way, I'm somewhat disconcerted about this. It raises a lot of questions for me.
As if it was easy to get out of the way. That's a whole different ability.
Yeah,
most people have no idea about how to do that. And that's really, really valuable.
Exactly. You know, maybe you should get out of the way actually for a while and see what falls apart.
I suppose there are two types of getting out of the way. One would be just running away and leaving things to themselves.
Yeah.
The other one would be a way of being where you don't get in the way of things, a sort of a different type of presence.
Yes, yes. And I take it that much of the exploration would probably go into today into what that kind of presence may be. About 2 weeks ago, Julia Cookhardt from Euphoria was on the Odi Talk, and she spoke about her research, and it was about identity amputation and or identity suicide in certain leaders. And the interesting finding there for me was that what happens in organizations, often at the executive level or at the more senior levels, is there's a whole lot of focus on performance. And it's all about performance, everyone says, but actually it's really not about that. It's about fitting in. Because it's so difficult to define performance. And then we as early practitioners come in, and our work is to do performance coaching, performance development, etc., etc., etc. And it actually just increases the crisis of the people who are in a system where actually, you know, the performance is not so important. What's more important is to fit in. So for me, that was also interesting and disconcerting. And then Dominic, something else that you said towards the end of our last conversation was something around this system, this time coming to an end.
Yes.
Yes.
Craig provoked me. That was it.
Yes. So I have to wonder about, okay, so what does it mean to be a leader in this kind of time? I think just a question also for me, if you speak about a time coming to an end, is it in the Heideggerian sense of an epoch coming to an end?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not suggesting that the planet Earth vanishes in the universe. I mean, who knows? That's a very remote possibility. But
if it finally becomes a simulacrum, can it disappear? If we become completely virtual.
Yes, I mean. So what you've just done is sort of thrown all kinds of signs into that I'm now sort of trying to figure out which one am I going to pick up first to.
Okay, that's my pleasure, Dominic.
Yeah, so of course, when I was talking in the last talk about the world coming to an end, then it's the world in the Heideggerian sense rather than planet Earth being wiped out by either climate change or a nuclear catastrophe.
You know, there's a quote from Heidegger's Der Spiegel interview where at some point he says, only a God can save us now.
Yes, and I suppose, you know, that's a whole other question is what does he mean by a God? And that's not sort of the God that we typically talk about in a religious conversation.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's sort of interesting just to pick up on that. This is a pre-talk. This is not what I prepared, but I probably can throw out what I prepared in any case. So we'll see how it goes. This is much more of an inquiry today than me giving a talk. So I suppose, if you look, this is the sort of idea of the history of being, which goes into this whole conversation that we had about being and truth of being, is that how things are is not static, it's not a given. And I suppose the notion of the history of being gives you an idea that in different epochs, we understood.
Thank you for calling Buttonwood Capital Advisors. Your call is very...
Now we got the gist of it. I can stop now.
The call is very important. Dominic.
I mean, what this idea of history of being, as far as I'm concerned, gives us is an idea that being is not static, is not a given, how things are. We usually sort of, when we talk common sense, then we say, but, you know, isn't it common sense? Well, common sense was very different in the medieval European medieval times, or ancient Greek, or now in the sort of industrial technological area. The very basics of what it means to be anything, including ourselves, is changing. And I suppose so I'm jumping completely to the end of the talk now.
It's all fluid.
We're going to do this in reverse now, because I was planning to play a little bit around with language. And I think the interesting thing with doing this kind of philosophical stuff in English is you actually have to start almost from scratch again, because in a different language you would develop those thoughts in quite a different way. And I suppose this whole idea, so to my mind, the fundamental notion of this whole Heideggerian thought is that rather than us looking at ourselves as subjects, understanding everything, including being a certain way, there is being within which everything, including ourselves, shows up. And yes, while we are the kinds of entities that have the sense of, or can at least, you know, have a conversation about being, which I suppose other living beings and any other beings don't have. It's not this sort of idea that my notion of being is somewhere in here and I sort of just look out and try to make sense out of everything. Is both the notion of being in language sort of are thought of as giving rise to everything. And I suppose the word that I actually think in the English language that I found so far is the best one is matter, how things matter. I mean, you walk somewhere and you say, what's the matter, so to speak? And so what causes mattering is, I think, a good access to this whole question of being. So why are we talking about this high convoluted stuff here? Well, I think that we have struck gold by looking at this whole question of management and leadership, as in management operates just blindly within a certain truth of being, within a certain notion of what everything is, while leadership alters or, you know, plays in that domain of being, brings itself in relation to being, articulates it, Heidegger would say, or unconceal it, sort of, because it's concealed, so you bring it out in the open, how everything is understood, including ourselves. So, and I suppose if you distinguish it that way, it also is no mystery why we have such trouble with leadership. And I suppose what we see globally is actually exactly that, is that there is actually right now no possibility for leadership. And if we look at those people that we say are leaders that are doing a good job, I would still say they're actually good managers. So I think the possibility of leadership is actually not really explored yet, understood. We talk a lot about leadership and it becomes either this mystical thing, or actually we're just talking about good management. If you are, if you're a climate denier, that's bad. It's a bad management start, because we have enough evidence to say you can't really be a climate denier. So that, in our current understanding, yes, it's completely scientific, this understanding, but that's, that's not nothing. The idea is not to trash science in those philosophical, even in the philosophical conversations that we're having, but to really understand what science can do. And I suppose science is very, very well able to determine whether there is climate change or not, and to constructively deal with it is still good management of the insights that we have. That's not leadership. You don't have to change your understanding of being to deal with this. You just need to accept sort of what we know and be sophisticated about it. Where were we? So if we're saying that leadership actually operates in the domain of being, or to be more precise, in the domain of the truth of being. And I'm merely saying that because when we say the domain of being, people sort of think there's something static there. And truth of being reminds us that there is a particular understanding, notion of being. How do we get to that? And that, that's also a response to what Craig brought up at the end of the last session, sort of what bothers me, is how do we then get access to that truth of being? How do we bring ourselves into the right relation to that? And I suppose the word, as I said, that I think helps us is the word matters. Something matters. Truth matters. Not that, or not truth, being matters. And usually we think that what I'm seeing is being is important, but what I'm saying is that being causes anything, including ourselves, to matter in a certain way. So I suppose if we look at an organizational reality, we can get to this, what sort of sounds esoterically as sort of when I say truth of being, is really to ask the question, what fundamentally matters here? What fundamentally is seen as is sort of taken for granted as this is really important, this is what counts, this is what it all basically gets down to. And I suppose if I look at my experience in working with companies and dancing around all kinds of boardrooms and excos, etc., you can see that actually what we in normal everyday language call ethics and governance and compliance does not matter. I mean, it obviously matters because people outside will say, well, if you don't have good governance, we're not going to buy anything from you, or we're not going to invest in you, or all of that kind of stuff. But that always then actually tells us that it matters because it has financial implications. And that, so we're going sort of in this roundabout way here in this conversation. By the way, guys, please come in at any time, because I'm developing this with you, and I'm taking the privilege of having you as a group that I can do that with, because we have the right relationship and understanding here.
Yeah. Two comments that came up from Craig. The first one is about being a manager. Craig, can you write there about create? That's the word that stands out for me. Create an enabled world. I love the word that you use later down, a paved path. you know, it's a context in which in which people can come and do what needs to be done. Now I know in ontological fundamentals, you speak about the two parts of the work. One part of the work is creating, and the other part is attending.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I suppose what we are doing here is actually taking this conversation sort of to the next level, because so if we deal with individuals, we call it listening, and if we deal with works, we call it attending, is to put ourselves in the right relation to the world that's there. And in the conversation that we're having now with regards to leadership, we're saying we are listening for that truth of being, both in the organization, in the world of the organization. Is what is it that causes mattering, so to speak? What matters here? And you can obviously ask the same question when, for example, I'm in a conversation with you and we're thinking about, I don't know, running a project with a company or starting a new branch in Europe for Worldview. Is you can listen to that conversation from a perspective of what is the truth of being here, because as a leader, I'm sort of also then playing in that domain. Mostly we're actually not playing in that domain. We're just looking at sort of how do we make our balance sheet and profit and loss account work, and what do we need to do that. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should not do that. The question with this notion of truth of being is what fundamentally matters, what gives meaning to everything else, and then the rest sort of comes in. Just like what I see in conversations in boardrooms is fundamentally the shareholder value matters, and that doesn't mean that you don't have a concern for morality any longer. It just becomes a sort of a subset to shareholder value rather than a fundamental one. And I'm not making a value judgment right now. I'm just saying let's start with figuring out how do I bring myself in the right relation to play in that domain of the truth of being.
It also seems to me, in terms of what matters, Nikki referred to Gary Hamel's new book, Humanocracy.
Yes.
And then there's a whole lot of other writing and research that's coming out at the moment that is about the rehumanization of the organization, reclaiming humanity. I've been looking at this conference that's happening at the moment, Samuelson Leadership for Changing Times, and there are things like reconstructing leadership from Peter Block, etc. Leadership in it seems to be this. There is a whole list of different matters that are, use the word matters, that are coming to the fore.
Yes.
That centers around this idea of being human. And at the same time, what I'm also hearing you say is that this idea of us, of what it is to be human, is something that has shifted considerably over time, and that we sit with a very specific kind of a way of understanding what it is.
Yes, so I mean,
human is.
Yes, and I suppose there are sort of variations in how the truth of being pans out in particular organizations or on a planetary level right now. And I suppose what I was saying with the world coming to an end is if you look at Heidegger's idea of technology, what matters is energy.
Mm.
What matters is our ability, is a sort of it looks at everything as a vast logistical project where we're able to, you know, move ever bigger things and sort of become masters of the universe in that way, because material and energy is what matters. And I suppose that is an interesting thing when suddenly you have actually a world where there is too much energy. In a way that's sort of, you know, a world where energy matters probably requires that there is a bit of a scarcity, or that, you know, if you have abundant energy, it sort of falls apart. And it's just the same way as with the whole notion of shareholder value and money that's available, is if indeed it is true, as I'm suggesting, that now we've moved from this energy and material notion of what matters to a financial shareholder value type notion. That also presumably falls apart if there is too much money around, and it's certainly in certain areas is no longer scarce, but there's too much money for buying the stuff that's there. Plus we don't have inflation. It's a really weird situation. But surely something's got to give, and it's quite possible that what is going to happen is that the whole, this sort of carpet of the truth of being that we're standing on is ripped.
Your sound has just suddenly gone very low. No, not at all. Now I can't hear you at all.
I'm back.
Yes, you're back.
I have these funny earphones that connect themselves to the computer by themselves without.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So the thing that I was saying is that so the truth of being is falling apart, so to speak, or is at least very likely to fall apart right now. And I suppose what that does lead to is on the one side confusion, and on the other side, of course, will be epoch changing in that sense if it happens, and maybe it's already happening. And I suppose the interesting thing with if you follow Heidegger, he already thought that this technological understanding is a very extreme way where there isn't just another epoch following, but something bigger, a change with regards to our relation to being.
So in a way, almost well, teleological, and in a way perhaps a little bit apocalyptical. That it's some of the terms, it's the idea of the end of history, or the age of the world picture.
Yeah, yeah, end of history. I mean, I suppose we'll yeah, maybe we will think about time differently going forward. So maybe in that sense, the end of history. But of course, time itself won't stop. At least I don't see that at all. I suppose the question is whether we just go into now a different truth of being, or whether our relationship to the truth of to that whole notion of the truth of being will alter, and that would then really require leadership going forward, because you can't manage when there is no truth of being within which something's being considered useful or not useful, and it sort of gives you the basic understanding and framework from which to work from.
Dominic, does this to an extent, because if we live in a world where we have increasingly unreflective relationship to our embankment
Yeah.
Gestalt, and there's this requirement of what Heidegger, I think, calls authenticity. Authentic relation. I can't remember how you translate that and what the German was. That is almost a way of extricating ourselves from this cultural from this unreflectiveness. And I think also he makes reference to drawing upon the resources that comes from culture. And I see also that in Craig's next comment, Craig, I don't know if you want to speak into this, but about bringing culture more explicitly into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the culture conversation could be a nice Trojan horse to do that kind of work with organizations. Because you can understand culture in terms of a world, and the problem with, just doing culture is there's so many different understandings of what culture is, and but certainly this whole notion of understanding the truth of being is also something that you could probably quite easily relate to if you deal with people from vastly different cultures, where there is also a different notion of what it means to be, what it means to be human, how everything fits together, how everything is understood, including ourselves.
Craig, it seems to me your suggestion is almost that the Trojan horse is in the measurement.
Well, I mean, it's just drifting there because I'm doing what I do. I try and write in order to see what I'm thinking. But just, what people talk about, it seems, in boards or leadership meetings is what they can measure. It's harder. It takes a lot of energy to shift the conversation to something else.
Yes.
So then you need a Trojan horse. It's helpful. And where my head was going now, Dominic, is the connection to if it's about what is it that has meaning, the choice of what is it that will have meaning for me is it perhaps an identity decision. So part of this is the individual identity, the collective identity, and you can play with that in the context of culture, because although culture is a largely useless word because everybody has different interpretations, it's an attractive word because everybody wants to talk about it right now. There's a kind of a zeitgeist where everybody wants to think about the organizational culture or national culture and our identity issues, certainly in South Africa. People are falling all over identity issues at the moment, in what I think is a cultural conversation. And at the heart of it is this question of what matters. Anyway, I don't know if that's helpful, but trying to shift those conversations in an organizational setting, it is identity, culture, strategy. And now you're at the main table and you've got the attention of the board, kind of thing.
Yes. I mean, I suppose so what you said earlier with the measurement, measurement is of course a really good starting point to look at what matters here. What do we make matter with how we measure things? So there is the first question is, what do we actually measure? And then the other one is, how come we see only as important what can be measured? How is measurement itself becoming constitutive, so to speak? And that's a technological thing, is that that's sort of the understanding of being that we have been given by science, and by science becoming definitive. And as I said, this has been no way a critique of science, but once again, a question sort of, should our lives be defined by science in that way, or is science a sort of a toolbox that allows us to deal with certain things in a really good way, but probably gives us no access to us understanding ourselves in an appropriate way?
Yeah, I was reading an article from Aeon magazine, and it was trying to get to the root of thought, of thinking.
Yeah.
Where does thinking happen? I thought it was an excellent article, and it played into this conversation that science has followed Descartes, and it has an assumption about how thought happens. And the article said that maybe that's not the way thought happens at all. That not how and not where and not and it is about being, what is it to be human? Can you, if you understand thought enough, could you create an artificial intelligence that achieves the singularity and starts to become aware?
Yes.
And that whole, then what is it to be human if you had a self-aware AI? So all of this, I know, I mean, geez, now we're really opening up the smorgasbord, but somewhere in there is leadership, and somewhere in there is
yes.
management.
No, exactly. So it's, I mean, let me put some structure to this conversation. So I suppose we can look at what determines the thoughts that sort of go through our heads, or that are engaged in when we're talking on an everyday basis. And Heidegger wouldn't call that thinking. Thinking is about exploring the truth of being, to put it in sort of kitchen sink language, as much as this is kitchen sink language here. But that's what he calls thinking, which is neither what philosophy is doing nor what science is doing. It's what I suppose he redefines in a way what thinking means. And why that's important here is because if we are saying leadership plays in the domain of being, then it's you think in action. And I was sort of looking at, so how the hell do we give people access to leadership? Well, I mean, I suppose it starts with actually realizing that we are always already operating in that domain of being, whether we know it or not. And just that acknowledgement puts me into a space where I'm now looking at things from a leadership perspective. It's just taking a different angle, so to speak, on things, where I'm saying, in the spirit of that Heidegger quote that we were working off in the last session, is if action, normally I look at my action as, is it useful? What is the product that comes out of that action useful? And if and the leadership conversation really is fundamentally a shift from saying, how do I, with what I've just done, how do I understand this from a perspective of the truth of being? What have I just enacted? What kind of truth have I just enacted? It's a different question that I'm asking, and it puts us into this completely different, domain of action, so to speak. And I suppose our project here is then to say, maybe the best way to start to look at this is, how is this already happening? How do I, from that perspective, how do I understand a project where I felt like I made a real difference, and where not even I was the same coming out of the project? What actually happened there? I can look at it from the point of view of utility, or I can look at it from the point of sort of accomplishment and possibility, so to speak. and it just gives me a totally different angle. And looking at it from that angle of accomplishment, I can see where I'm already leading. I mean, one of the things where this is becoming really real for me is in bringing up children, where I know that my children are basically hooking into a truth of being that I'm living in, that I'm enacting. It has nothing to do with how they turn out, has nothing to do with my theory or my opinion about all of that kind of stuff. But it's an if I look at it from an enactment of the truth of being, it gives me a totally different access to the task of being a parent. And I can see that they are enacting my truth of being. That's where actually bringing up other human beings happens. That's not a sort of a utilitarian point of view says you need to now be quiet, and if I promise to take you to McDonald's and then you're quiet, that's sort of very utilitarian. But of course, when I do that from an accomplishment point of view, is I'm enacting a truth of being, and am I enacting the truth of being that I think I want to enact? But it gives me a different angle to look at this whole thing. And I suppose the same thing is if I run a consulting project, or if I'm in charge of an organization, either in a position of authority or not, is what I'm doing from a perspective of how it enacts the truth of being. How does it look from there? And I suppose the thing that's interesting is that if I interrogate my actions from that point of view, it gives me an idea of what is my truth of being. But because I'm inquiring into it, suddenly I can play in that domain.
It seems the word that keeps coming up in the Heidegger language is concealment, unconcealment.
Yes.
What seems to be concealed is this relation to truth of being. And I don't know if I understand that correctly. But I have this sense that much of our work in the organization is work of unconcealment.
Yes.
Unconcealment of the leadership that is already there and already happening. Unconcealment of the culture that is already coming into being. In any case, always already. The world in which the world that is revealed to us or unconcealed to us. And then it's not,
I suppose,
not so much,
yeah, go ahead.
It's not so much about, this is so because sometimes for me in leadership, it feels like we are bringing things, we are bringing skills, we bring capabilities, we bring capacities, we're developing competencies, and all of that work, but that work just always operates within what remains concealed or unrevealed, and therefore things are just spinning ahead in sort of the way that it has been spinning ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose as I said, I'm inviting you to look at it from the perspective of your everyday experience and moments where you think that happened, and to just explore that rather than to think of what we're doing here as, oh, this is all new. No, it's not all new. It's valid to the degree that we recognize this is what's actually already happening, and particularly happening when we're saying that there was real leadership. And I suppose we can then still ask the question, oh, was that just good management or was it good leadership? But I still think that the way to relate to this whole conversation is to really look at sort of how does this happen? And that the interesting thing in this Heideggerian way of thinking about being is that the transformation happens in this unconcealment, in sort of telling the truth about the truth of being, is because usually we just operate within, I mean, let's call it a paradigm or a culture or a whatever, within a certain understanding where certain things are useful and other things are useless. And we, you know, run like, certainly in a technological age, we run like hell to, you know, get better and better and better, as if there was ever anywhere to get to. But we pretend there is somewhere to get to, even though shareholder value maximization is an open-ended project, and the movement of energies is also an open-ended project. So it just actually drives us nuts. But if we talk about it this way, that's, I mean, in a way, I'm sort of at least trying to demonstrate the moment of unconcealment of the truth of being, where you say, oh yeah, this is really what's going on. And I think the interesting thing is that in that unconcealment happens the transformation. Because it's not like what we are taught to is we should get control over being. That's a silly project, and that neglects what's actually really going on here. I mean, Heidegger, for good reason, uses all kinds of different words to describe this relationship. He talks about the guardian of that humans are the guardian of being, or the shepherd of being, or the neighbor of being, because it's not like it's in here, but it is what gives rise to everything, including ourselves, with the difference that, unlike all other entities, we are the ones that can sort of articulate it, refer back to it, and by articulating it, something really interesting happens. Something really, something beyond interesting happens. And I suppose we are saying that that's, I mean, that's what I'm putting forward here, is that that's actually the domain of leadership, is that we're playing in that space. And it remains in the hermeneutic circle. It remains in, and that's not a limitation. So if I say it remains in the hermeneutic circle, that sounds like, oh my God, I'm caught in a cage type thing. No, it just says that if I play in that domain, it's not me as the sovereign who determines what's going on. Is I'm building on the always already truth of being, articulating it either in words or in action, which is, you know, words are also action, and sort of that's that's a sort of a lame distinction between words and action. That we need to then learn is, what is that game with the truth of being that constitutes leadership? How does that actually work? And that it's not this, you know, superior human being that stands above everything and has total control, but it's a completely different kind of engagement that is not easily understood with a normal Western mindset.
It puts a completely different spin on almost leadership as participation.
Yes. I mean, it certainly sort of also destroys this notion of there must be leaders and followers. You know, it's not like, you know, it's not like I'm the leader and you need to follow me or something like that. In real leadership, I'm not sure whether you sort of think in terms of followers. In management, you would, because you are saying you do this task and you do that task, and sort of you manage things. I suppose in a technological commercial world, it's, you know, how do I use the human resources in the right way?
Yeah.
And I suppose then I also need to make every effort to conceal that I'm using them as resources, because that's not, but that's in a way more confirmation that we're still living in this technological commercial world. Otherwise, I wouldn't have to conceal anything. That it just would also not be necessary.
Yeah.
With leadership, you are operating in a different domain, where it's not about leaders and followers. And as a leader, you would not feel like, oh, I'm leading now. You know, that sort of Western notion that we have of leadership is like leading us into complete darkness here.
Yeah, yeah. There's some comments, Dominic, that I just want to put in.
Yeah.
One is from Jenny, and then there's a few from Janet. Jenny refers to the Buber I thou I eat, which I mean, for me, that's just always very intriguing.
Yes.
Because sometimes also I think Ken Wilber, Ken Wilber make that a quadrant where it's individual, collective, the gestalts, and then he has objective, subjective. But I always think the objective, subjective is still very Cartesian. It's actually would have worked better if he said I, you, I, it, because it implies a completely different existential mode.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose the Buber work, I actually haven't read it for a while, is a lovely entry point into this sort of dialogical relationship where actually you're realizing that sort of this is not two subjects relating to each other.
Yeah.
But it gives you an entry point to we are given by being, and we play a certain role in this domain of being.
I guess it further, I mean, in psychology, also went in that direction is Erich Fromm with the being mode and the having mode.
Yes.
Of being. And then there's Janet. I don't know if you want to maybe just speak into your own comment. Is Janet still there? Yes.
I am. I just don't have a working camera. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
So which one particularly? Maybe for me, one of the most interesting is you were talking earlier about just looking at this concept of being, and especially when we are journeying together. I enable facilitators. It's one of the things I really love to do. And one of the conversations I usually have with them is around transactional objectives and transformational objectives. Yes. So when we are crafting a facilitation, I think it is important that we look at both of those. The transactional objectives would be those that we would typically call an agenda or the tangible deliverables.
Yes.
The transformational objectives revolve around how will people be different because we went on this journey together.
Mm.
And I think that very often as facilitators, we are not conscious of that question before in our development process, in our design process. And what's really cool about it is that we can design that only up to a point. We can design an experience which enables and facilitates transformation, but we actually have no control over how that lands. I often talk about laying out a buffet table before people, and I have no idea what their appetites are, what their needs are, what they might choose, how their choices might impact on other people's choices. I can simply create this experience and allow people to be transformed based on who they are at this particular moment and the choices that they make. And it's what makes my work very cool.
Yes, but I mean, I suppose, so let me put a different spin on what you've just said, is I think that you can what you're ultimately doing is if you facilitate this, you are actually surrendering to language. You're not understanding yourself as this entity, but you let language take its course. And of course, you can create a conducive environment for language to take you there. And I suppose that's also, you know, I'm saying this also because it's totally relevant for the whole conversation that we have here, is if you talk about getting access to the truth of being and playing this role in unconcealment, is you're just sort of surfing language, so to speak.
That's a fascinating thought. I need to think more about that.
Yeah, because I mean, usually, so critical to this whole thing is our understanding of language, and mostly we see language as a tool to produce certain things, rather than that which we are a gift of, so to speak. And if we give ourselves back to language in the way that it gives us, suddenly there is something profoundly transformational that becomes available.
Can I ask a question? Would you use the word language?
Yeah.
How would you contrast that with dialogue?
I mean, I suppose dialogue is already bringing yourself into language in a particular way. And once again, so I think useful to just sort of observe what we have been doing here in the last hour, because I have not followed the structure. I have not used language really as a tool, so to speak, and we are dancing with the things that are coming up by themselves in the conversation. And it sort of miraculously takes us to the right places for what we're doing. And I suppose it's not just any old conversation. So there are certain things that we have put in place here that enable the situation where language can itself take us to a place by itself, so to speak, rather than me saying I have plotted out this path and I'm forcing us down that path, you know, or follow a certain argument. And I'm not saying that there's necessarily always something wrong with doing that. There may well be a time when it's good to just lay out a certain thing. But what we have done here so far is we have followed where language took us.
In a way, transformational objectives, the idea of objectives, they, for me, always becomes a little bit problematic, because in a way, the transformation itself is, if you have, that's what you are doing, that's what you are participating in. But I love that the conversation touches on facilitation, because facilitation is such a key aspect of organization development work.
Yeah.
And also, if we say we are going to become better leaders ourselves, or not better leaders, we are going to access that domain where we can be leaders, and we are going to facilitate others in organizations to also access that being place. It is about this facilitating work, this helping work.
Yes, and I mean, facilitation may well be a really good word in the English language to talk about, you know, playing in that domain of being, because you know, that's why Heidegger uses words like shepherd of being, because as a shepherd, you're sort of looking after things, but you can't grow the sheep yourself. You need to make sure that sort of the right places, the right things are in place, and you can't even tell the sheep where to go. You set up a certain logic that sort of takes care of itself, where the dog runs around, and between the dog and the sheep, etc., they sort of figure out where to go, and you're never there dominating the what's going on. You're facilitating something. I mean, I suppose facilitating is a good word.
You earlier said that, well, in the pre-talk that anarchism doesn't really work. And I'm wondering,
Yes.
Maybe anarchism just needs a few shepherds.
Yeah, but I mean, I suppose that talks to that, also to a thing that was, I think you brought it up earlier with regards to presence, is that how am I present as a leader? Not as, here I am, as the controller, so to speak. And your presence is not there in this as a phenomenon, which is completely puzzling for us Westerners, where, as Cartesians, Marxists, capitalists, everything needs to be made visible, tangible. And I suppose the interesting thing is in capitalism, we make stuff tangible that's not tangible, but we still succeed in sort of at least pretending it's tangible with numbers and stuff like that. Even though it really isn't tangible, it's just a conversation, but we bring it into that. If we look at leadership, how am I present? And I love that situation as a facilitator, because when you're really masterful in facilitation, you really are not there as a phenomenon at all. You're, I mean, for lack of a better word, completely transparent. Your presence is of a completely different nature than the presence that we think of in empirical terms. You're not empirically no longer present, so to speak, but you are present in a very different way, I suppose, in a constitutive way rather than in a experiential way.
Yeah, it's there. When you talk like that, I have a sense that I somehow get what is meant by open for being, or openness for being.
Yeah.
I'm sort of
exactly.
a feeling for it that I can't quite put into words, which is probably why Heidegger used the term, is because it's so specific and it can't really be explained with other words.
What did you say can't be explained with other words?
The concept openness for being, because I have a sense that this is the space where you go where openness for being, shall I be?
I suppose openness for being is a characterization of what we are as human beings. That's sort of our very nature, so to speak. That's what it means to be a human being, is that we have that ability to, I mean, in the context of this conversation, we would say we have the ability to lead. We have the ability to play in this domain of being, not as being the dictator of being, but as playing in the domain of being given by being and sort of engaging with it. And I suppose, facilitating a conversation is, I think, a really great way to look at how does that happen when it succeeds, and who am I? How do I understand myself? How am I present in a facilitated conversation? And I suppose the thing is, if I'm looking at those conversations or workshops where I was facilitating really well, I was neither there for me nor for others. I had no, experience of myself, nor was I experienced by others. And at the same time, it's very clear that this conversation would not have happened the same way if I had walked out the door and wasn't there at all, so to speak. but I wasn't there in an empirical way, because I mean, empirical means you can experience it, you can make it visible, you can. It becomes empirical means you're dealing with phenomena, and there you are as a leader. You're not dealing in the domain of the phenomenal.
It's to what Nancy Klein says in the Time to Think thinking, that as listener, you are not, your presence, who you are doesn't matter, but your presence matters absolutely.
Yes, and I suppose, you know, we have normally funny ways to sort of listen, because we sort of say, oh, I'm really attentive now, etc. I suppose, and we think of listening as a phenomenon, and it's not a phenomenon, and that makes it so tricky for us as Westerners to deal with it, because you sort of think, oh, I saw someone who was listening and they were sitting in a certain way, and now I need to sit in that way and sort of look at the other person in the eye or whatever. And the thing about listening is that if you're really listening, you are no longer a phenomenon. What there is only the stuff that's listened to, that's heard, that's there. Listening itself is not a phenomenon, and we don't know usually how to deal with this. And I suppose learning to listen is for the most part just taking away all the stuff that's a phenomenon there, because it's not listening until there is nothing there anymore, no phenomenon. And at the same time, of course, there is something there, but not a something.
Yeah. It resonates, I think, with Janet, what you say there about, and it brings back the question, the Trojan horse of measurement. When you used to be measured in terms of connection and how you felt about it. But Dominic, what the question that it also opens up for me about the work that we do as practitioners in organizations is, I know from conversation with you much earlier this year, you had thoughts about, on the one hand, the development of individual leaders, and how most of the time that's not very effective. And on the other hand, what we can do to, what aspects of the world in which these leaders show up we can change. And
well, if I remember our conversation correctly, so the start, one of the pivotal starting points for this whole journey was that people were saying, if you want to change an organization or transform an organization or whatever you want to call it, is you need to transform or work with a critical mass of people, and then the whole thing will change.
Yeah.
And there may well be areas where you can think in those terms of critical mass, but not in the domain of being. I suppose where that got me to was to say, if you want to alter an organization, you don't alter it by putting lots of individuals through some sort of training course or leadership development or transformational experience or whatever. You need to look at what is the organization itself. You know, what kind of an entity is this, and how do you inquire into it, and how do you now engage with it? What do you do, for lack of a better word, to cause what you could call a transformation in an organization, which is somewhat different to a transformation of a human being type thing. So and I suppose the thing here is, if I'm leading an organization, what I would have to bring myself into relation with is what is the truth of being in this organization. What is, and to put it into a more everyday language is what matters in this organization, because being causes mattering, so to speak. That's at least the best approximation that I could find so far. So you could look at what matters, and that gives you an idea of what the truth of being is. So if all that matters is shareholder value, then you have a truth of being that makes shareholder value matter, and that's really everything. And you can then interrogate, okay, so is this really all that matters? And you say, well, we had a conversation in the boardroom about someone being not compliant or not fulfilling their duty or behaving in an immoral way. How do we actually talk about it? And does it actually all boil back down to all we're worried about this lack of morality is because it could damage the business, that shareholder value could suffer. And I'm not saying that that's good or bad. We always live in a truth of being, and the project here is really to just get to that and then say, okay, now that we have been truthful about the truth of being, so to speak, suddenly you are playing in that domain, and because you've articulated it, you now have opportunities to play there. And that doesn't mean that you now can become immediately the dictator and have control over it, but you're starting to play in it. And the more you articulate it, the more language itself can take you to a different truth, not you, but language.
It seems almost there's a key piece of work for us in any case, which is to support or to enable that kind of attention and or attentiveness to, and maybe this is practitioner or consultant arrogance, which goes in and says that people in organizations are not paying attention to these things. They're so embanked and they're so caught up in the system that they just spin ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the point about that is you need to fetch people from where they are. That's the acknowledgement of the hermeneutic circle is if you teach, you explain something from what people already understand. When you consult, you pick an organization and its management up from how they understand it. So if measurement is what's important, is then the question becomes, how can I acknowledge that and use that language to build a path to wherever, but at least fetch them from where they are with the methods that they are used to in the language that they comprehend. So that becomes then the project.
Yes. What in your prepared talk did we not touch on?
Well, all of, I mean, I suppose we are talking about the same things in sort of all kinds of different ways. So it would be easy, it would be truthful to say we've covered everything. And that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be in some way helpful things to explore further. I think that what would help is to look at where this is happening, has happened. What's your experience about what enables this kind of inquiry, and where if you look at things from a leadership perspective, you are already leading. So, I mean, it's not like, if you look at this understanding of leadership as accomplishment and playing in the domain of being, of course, you're already playing in the domain of being. You've never shone that light on your action, or you and I. I'm not putting myself beyond that. For the most part, I'm obviously exactly like everyone else, as we do all those things and we see whether we got through our to-do lists and all of that kind of stuff, and that's what we do. And it's not like, oh, there's something wrong now, we're doing something else. That it's just to, you know, shine a different light on it and say, sort of, what is the truth of being that I'm enacting while I'm doing this, or what's the truth of being that we are enacting in what we're doing, and how does things look from there, and what were moments when I think I was leading, what happened there. As I said, it's sort of strange to look at it because it's, as I suggested, not something where you say, well, I was here and I did this and that's what changed. But I suppose it's still useful to interrogate into those moments that presumably all of us have where we are leading. And I suppose one of the things that how you would recognize a situation like that is that you altered yourself. You came out you suddenly were yourself in a different world, and therefore understood yourself in a different way. And maybe even sort of disappeared as a phenomenon, so to speak. But of course you were still there, just not as a phenomenon, but as what is, I suppose, what we're inquiring into, and look at what can help us to lead. What can, you know, how can we set this up in our consulting practice, in our leadership development, in how we facilitate a strategic conversation. Those are obviously the entry points that we are given, and then the question is, how do we take those as a launch pad for leadership rather than management? And I mean, I'm not, and I suppose that's the other thing is, I'm not saying, okay, there is management and it's inferior, and there is leadership and it's superior, yeah. Or there is, you're either managing or you're leading. That's not really the question. As a good leader, you would have to be a good manager, because you have to have a really in-depth, enacted understanding of how things work around here and how we do things. So this is not a dichotomy where you're either one or the other. It's more a different understanding of the same thing, which is, depending on how you understand it, gives you a different access to the domain that you are now able to play in.
So can I chip in there?
Yeah, most definitely. I'm waiting for someone to say something before I talk you all to death.
I put something in the chat earlier, and I'm not going to be pedantic about my language right now because it does need some more thought, but I often talk about leadership and management as what we need to do to harness resources to get stuff done.
Yeah.
The resources that we work with, which we work, are either people, human resources, or they're non-human resources. You cannot lead any non-human resources. You can't lead accounts, you can't lead buildings, you can't lead any of those kind of things. You can only lead people. And that's the distinction I make. I believe that leadership is the people side of stuff, management is the stuff side of things. And the challenge comes from an OD perspective when people use the language of management and manage people. rather than leading them. And I find that a useful framing.
Well, let me reframe or re-articulate it in the way that that I was developing the thinking. So I said, if you lead and you understand leading is playing in the domain of being, everything would change. Everything would be different, would be, yes, I mean, I suppose not for nothing are we human beings in this conversation who are engaging in this conversation, because I can't engage with the table in front of you in this conversation. So we play in this leadership game. It is playing in the domain of being by surrendering to language and language taking us there. And we do that with people, but if we start to play in the domain of being, it alters everything. It alters how things mean things, how they matter, how they fit together, how they are relevant, and how we are relevant to ourselves. And what I'm really trying to move our thinking from is you and I being those subjects that just interact with each other, to the two of us engaging in the truth of being, which gives rise to how we matter, how we understand ourselves, who we are, what is possible next, and what things mean. So nothing is sort of left untouched, even though of course we don't touch them in the phenomenal empirical sense or physical sense when there is leadership.
Luleko, question from you.
Jeanette,
Hi,
you want to say
everyone.
something before we go to the next one? Luleko, or have I shut you up forever?
You've made me think. So I would say yes, and.
Yeah.
And where I find myself going is wrestling with the binary, which I have put forward, which I find useful, and maybe what's the right word? A meta concept that embraces both, which I would see in what you are talking about. Because I'm working at the moment, I'm busy finishing my master's, looking at wicked problems and looking at engagement and interaction as not just a human phenomenon.
Yeah.
So yes, there's lots going on in my head.
Okay, great. Thanks. Luleko.
Hi everyone, my name is Luleko. So I received this invite and I was attracted by one of the sentences around asking the question on what are the practical implications for us as OD practitioners in the understanding. Because I've also been reflecting on leadership, whether my own, where I am, the spaces that I move in, or whether I live in with others. And with some organizations,
breaking up.
I am
Will you
finding.
just repeat? Will you repeat? Because you have been breaking up a bit.
Okay, I have everything closed. So yeah, no, I was just saying that I've been reflecting probably as anyone in 2020, but also about this idea of leadership, either as a leader, as a facilitator, or as a human being that is alive on earth at this moment. And this reflection also was brought about by what has been happening in the world, not only in South Africa. And also a reflection that is also coming out of annoyance, because for me as a person, also feeling that I have to explain my being on earth, because the leadership that I am responding to perhaps does not necessarily see me as a human being. So my reflection is at a point where it's confirming that perhaps our understanding of leadership, obviously not all of us, some things are good, yes. Our understanding of leadership and how we've been facilitating leadership has been, if some of the issues that happened this year are still happening. So is really leadership about engaging? Should it also not be collaborative? And also about empowering others, and also being ready of having these difficult conversations. For example, there was a comment earlier about how in some spaces, you know, the bottom line is about sales, about performance, is about profit. Anything else comes secondary. And that has shown up in some of the scandals that we see in the news, that, you know, leadership in that corporation, you know, leaves us with a lot of questions. In any case, I know there are other people here, leaders, practitioners, and all of that. And my question is to you all. I'm really interested to hear from you, from your own journeys. How has it been in your reflection? Is the way things are at the moment making you also question your leadership, or the leadership that you get into conversation with others? And for those of you who are changing some things, how are you doing that change? How are you developing yourselves further, for example? Because what we've been doing, or what has been there, it's really not enough. It has not been collaborative. It's not. I mean, yes, there are good things that are happening. I would tell you a story. I don't have enough time. But for some of us, we also decided to just, you know, end our salaries at the end of the day and just keep quiet and go back home to our families. However, with climate change, which most people like to talk about because that makes them feel better, to with climate change, even with other issues on the fore, then we really need to start having a different conversation on leadership. And I'm just curious to hear other thoughts from other people. So for you as a facilitator, working into an organization, or I don't know, a corporation, so what are you working with? You know, what is your leadership brand or leadership conversation brand? So what do you bring in? For those also who are making changes, I really am interested to hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Lily. Well, I mean, I think that the interesting thing about the times that we're in is that we are powerless. So we sit there and we're saying, look, certainly from a managerial point of view, we are, I think, more powerless than we have been for a long time. That's certainly what I'm present to. And I had a long conversation with a friend of mine in the US yesterday. And you sort of look at what you think is determining the future of how things are going. And you're saying, well, I really do not see anything meaningful that I can do to make people vote for a half-intelligent president in the United States in the state of Florida. In most of my life, I had a sense that there is something I can do about the things that matter and that shape the future, even for, you know, South Africa, the world, whatever. I do not see this right now. And that's a new situation that I'm finding myself in. And I suppose not like new, like, oh, it happened overnight. No, it's been happening over the last 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years or so. I suppose it's a really great question that you're asking, because hopefully this conversation gives us a platform to actually look at that. And I suppose if I look at your question, it's maybe I have not even in my own life looked at it from a leadership perspective, but really from a managerial perspective. Because from a managerial perspective, I'm asking, what can I do? What can I manage? What can I initiate to make things better? Do something about climate change and income inequality and racism and all the things that sort of seem to really drive us down completely the wrong way. And if history is anything to go by, this is not going to end well at all where we're going right now. And at the same time, there seems to be no obvious managerial intervention that I can see from my side, and I presume that that's probably also true for everyone else on the course. Is that you sort of say, from the point of view of taking initiative, formulating projects, all of that kind of stuff, it doesn't seem like it's where it's possible to change anything. And certainly that's what I'm present to. And for a Westerner who thinks like me that there is making something, if you need to make something happen, the question is not can I make something happen, but only how do I find out how I can make something happen? And that just seems to be an avenue that looks pretty closed right now. And of course, I'm still thinking about it, and maybe there is something to be done, but it looks like that's more closed than ever. And that the possibility of leadership has not even really arisen the way that I'm developing, or we are developing it here. And I'm really saying we, because yes, I've done a lot of thinking, but it actually only becomes real for me in the conversation that we're having here. And without that, it's just not there. And so it's a sort of we phenomena, but a conversation about what gives rise to this, which I call here with a Heideggerian term, truth of being. And I think that one of the things that also Heidegger says is what you will find is if you go there, at first you will have no words, and that's exactly where I am right now, is that I'm sort of lacking the words, but I suppose what a privilege that we are together there, battling for words and maybe not having to say much at this point, and just standing there and saying, well, let's just let language take over and see where it can take us. Because certainly from I know how to do this and I'm a good manager, and if we just get people together in the right way, there is no obvious path for me right now. Those have all broken down overall in the last 20 years, and obviously particularly in the last 5 years or so, where you just sort of say we have these challenges. And yes, I love going to Black Lives Matter protests and anti-Brexit protests. For the most part, they are wonderful aesthetic experiences, and I'm sort of wondering what they do. I think it's time to you know, have an entirely different conversation about this.
This sometimes make me think of that Günter Grass novel, The Rat, Die Rettin,
Yeah.
where the humans finally, through some mistake, set off nuclear war, and the whole planet is going to be destroyed, and then all the things that take place in this final stage of futility, and and I'd love to think that we're not there, but it's sometimes difficult. There's also that other thing that Horkheimer said. They said, I don't believe things will turn out well, but the very idea that they might is of decisive importance.
Well, I mean, I suppose to some degree, I think we're living both in a desperate and a magical time at the same time.
Yeah.
And I'm not just saying this to sort of lift spirits, etc. It's just because I think that if we look at the way that we spent the last 1.5 hours or a little more, just puts me in the presence of that.
Yeah, and what for me is heartening is that we can bring this vulnerability of not knowing and actually having come to the end of whatever big instrumentalist project we were fully engaged in, and we can just see that.
And I suppose it's obvious that if this epoch's coming to an end, that's obviously how we would feel. We would feel like everything that we've learned is falling to shreds. And as long as we stay within that sort of utilitarian conversation, everything that was useful is no longer undisputedly useful, becomes relatively useful. All the skills that we have learned would be relatively useful rather than something to really rely on. Of course, this is how we would feel. Of course, we can't see what comes next. We can't see it. Because it's, you know, we need to learn to stay in that non-phenomenal space, in the conversational space. It's not giving us a bridge in the way that we're used to in the old reality that we come from. And of course we would feel that way right now. And I suppose let's look at sort of how would we now need to enable that kind of conversation, dialogue that is required right now, where of course we would have no idea who we are at the end of that dialogue, or even as we go through the dialogue. I suppose there's no end to a dialogue, so that
Becky, your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. I've got so many notes and so many things going on in my head. I've just found this conversation amazing, and it's touching so many things that I'm experiencing now myself. But just kind of building on the questions that Lelequa was raising, just around you know, what the rest of us are feeling, and if we're feeling the same thing that she is, in terms of being surrounded by or working with leaders where this this whole notion and truth of being, you almost feel like you're the black sheep or this you know, I personally feel extremely isolated because I'm experiencing the same thing with the senior leaders and executives that are my colleagues. And so I think it was Craig earlier who said, you know, what fundamentally matters here. So what fundamentally matters here at this organization that each one of us is a part of. And really what struck me was I could see that, you know, we've got this this new MD that came in from Brazil, and everything he talks about, he does talk about caring about people and leadership, but his actions and his words are focusing on the importance of ethics and governance and compliance. And I think the tension, the structural tension that I'm feeling is because in my mind that does not matter. So when I hear it, I'm like, you know, rightly or wrongly wanting to roll my eyes and say, okay, here I go again. And then when I started asking myself the question, so what really matters to me? I just started like writing things down. Like, it matters to me that our people don't feel appreciated. It matters to me that our people are full of fear and they don't speak up, and they don't speak their minds. It matters to me that people don't feel included. It matters to me that women aren't feeling like they're appreciated or valued, along with many other employees. And I could keep going on and on and on. And then I came up with, it matters to me that I feel discounted. So, you know, the other part of my situation is that I've recently been retrenched. So I'm working through, sorry, I forgot to turn my phone off. I'm working through my last 2 weeks. So I'm saying to myself, I don't want to end up in another organization where what matters is not aligned with what matters to me. And not to say that I have it all right, but maybe behind all of this is, you know, what is the, like, the question is, how can we be more diligent, or how can we make sure that when we leave these organizations where, like, you know, I'm feeling exhausted and I'm sick of fighting and I'm sick of feeling like every time I open up my mouth that the people around me are saying, here she goes again, is how do I find an organization where I'm not saying, you know, it's not about being like me, but where what matters to me as a leader, there are at least some others, or ones that I can see will have the courage that we can work together and keep standing up for what matters to us, and truly be able to make a difference without feeling like we have to change ourselves, because clearly we've lost our minds. Because what matters, especially the truth of being, and how important that is to me as an individual, that that is right, and I still am on the right path, and I shouldn't give up.
And I mean, I think that what you're saying gives me an opportunity to clarify something that I think is sort of a nugget of gold in what you've just handed over to me here. Is we sort of think is my conviction of what matters to me is what's important. And in a leadership conversation, that's no longer the question. The question is what matters. What is the always already mattering that happens here? And by articulating it, it takes us into a different world. We sort of, you know, I suppose it sort of nicely articulates my dilemma. Is I think there are things that deeply matter to me, and I live in a world where I feel absolutely powerless to do something about it. And I suppose that is, in a way, by its nature so, because it does not matter what matters to me. Where I can make a difference is by looking at how do things matter here? What is the mattering that happens that leads to all this garbage? Because of course, that I feel isolated, and you used a couple of really wonderful words to describe, I think, how we all feel right now, is a function of the truth of being that we're living in. And it's there where the difference is made, but not like I can ride in as the knight in shining armor, change the truth of
Mhm.
it will take care of itself, and my role is to be that place where it can be unconcealed, articulated, and it will take its own way, and the world will
Yeah.
take care of itself if we are prepared to be the place where this conversation happens.
Yeah, and like the other thought that I wrote down that I wanted to ask your thoughts on was like, what is the connection between the truth of being, and then if I'm enacting my truth, then what is the link to that between, as I'm doing that, is being in my own, like being authentic, being genuine, and possibly being more comfortable, being vulnerable as well. And like all of these things connected? Like that's what I'm thinking they are, but maybe then.
I think that
Yeah.
idea of personal authenticity, like the way that we have us, is leading us into complete darkness. And that's because I think that we think of ourselves as phenomena. So I feel about something strong. That's obviously something that I experience. I'm saying that when I'm actually really myself, there's no phenomenon there. So if I feel something, it's because there's something out of kilter, something sort of, in technical terms, we call it a privation of myself, a sort of an impoverished version of myself, a sort of a subverted, turned around, seen from the wrong side type thing. So I think that this and while I'm not for a moment suggesting sort of how you feel right now, should not be fully acknowledged. I think that that's precisely the task of what to do with all of what you're feeling, is to totally acknowledge that that's how I'm feeling right now, and that's what's so. And at the same time, seeing that whatever you feel about yourself is actually not yourself, is a sort of an inverted version of yourself. That obviously we need to look at how to deal with this and resolve those things, but that steal us away from leadership, from actually taking on leadership. So if I look at most people's notion of authenticity, you sort of say, I feel a certain way, or this is right for me, etc. If you are really yourself, you are totally, I suggest you're totally transparent, you're not there. And you are in a totally different place to also make a difference, move things, play in that truth of being. So I think that whenever we're talking about our personal stuff that's sort of in a different domain, and wherever we become phenomena to ourselves, there is something amiss, rather than that's who I really am. And of course, we need to deal with the amiss. So I'm not saying, well, we need to deny yourself and all of that. No, I think it's great to feel what you're feeling and to be fully present to everything that's going on there. I think that whatever you experience about yourself is a sign of something amiss, or what is called a privation. And we are still far from really figuring out how to deal with those things properly. But for sure, it starts with, again, telling the truth about them.
Well, please figure it out very quickly, because I need it. I need it right now.
I mean, I suppose we can engage, inquire into that, set up another conversation about that. So that's I'm happy about that. I'm just saying that if we talk about playing in the domain of being, that's something different to what in the public discourse is about authentic leadership or anything like that. For me, this is a sort of a bit of a nonsense word to talk about authentic leadership, because
there's this whole line of authentic become a bit of a fad almost. that has got a very specific meaning.
Would probably relate to something about yourself that you're experiencing.
Yeah, and it would make the primary mistake of essence before existence instead of existence before essence, because we would say there's some authentic essence of the self that I just need to.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the problem is that we as Westerners think of that essence as a something, as a phenomenon, something that we can experience. And my experience of leading is that I'm not there. There is no phenomena, Dominic. I'm leading.
I guess.
Yeah.
I
think it's, Sorry, go ahead, Crystal.
I guess at its best, that's what coaching would do, or psychology.
Yeah.
It would be that work of unconcealment, or of making what appears to be the phenomenon visible, or what Sartre would call bad faith or mauvais faith. Or self-deception.
Yeah, no, I think, it's definitely a good conversation for me to have at the moment, because obviously as I look forward to where I want to go next, is I need to get this straight in my mind, because I don't want to take, the only way I can sum it up is that if this is all too much about me, then what I'm projecting to others around me would be exactly that.
Yeah, and
which isn't helpful. Isn't helpful for me or them.
I'm not saying it shouldn't be about you, but my question is what you mean by you. So I think it's great when things are about you, as long as that you is really you. And I'm saying that you is confusing for us Westerners because it's not a phenomenon. It's not something empirical. Just like the question is sort of how am I present when there is leadership, when I'm leading, when is not phenomenal in that sense. And therefore, if I'm saying I'm true to myself, what people usually mean is I need to look really deeply into how I feel about something, and then I need to act in integrity with how I feel. And I'm saying that whatever you feel about yourself is not yourself. Is whatever you feel there as myself is something that you, of course, absolutely genuinely feel, and that has something to do with yourself, but it's sort of an inversion of yourself, and therefore something to be acknowledged rather than adhered to, rather than become a slave of. I think that you would become a slave of a sort of almost perverted version of yourself.
This is
still yourself, so to speak, but it's sort of an impoverished version of yourself. And if it wasn't impoverished, you wouldn't feel a thing. There wouldn't be anything.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
I think that here's something for a whole another conversation. Is I like that this privation of self, this illusion of the phenomenal self, and etc. But anyways, Dominic, we need to have another conversation because just because of this thing that you said towards the end. I mean, we spoke about powerlessness, which I think was profound, and I think it's probably very important that we go there back and encounter this and come to terms with it. I also love that sort of Heideggerian use of that phrase, "come to terms with." But you said
that's an English phrase, and you can't say that in German. It's not a.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's sort of a thing in the English language that is sort of one of those magical moments, because it really sort of you need to come to the terms of it, and that's this sort of how language messes around in the unconcealment.
It's wonderful that you get gains. You lose some in translation, but to be fair, you also gain.
Yes, and I suppose that sort of coming to terms with is one, and I suspect that whole notion of being matters, and
Yes.
not saying it that what we're saying is what's important is being, but being
Matter.
makes everything matter.
Yeah.
Maybe another one of those.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Could be the conversation. Could be the. I'm speculating. Could be the
being matters. Yes.
Could be a word that we can explore to look at this powerlessness and where and what is the nature of the power of leadership.
Yeah.
Which is not managerial power.
Yes. Good. We'll clarify that and make updates. And I love that idea. But the reason is because you said we must be prepared to be the place where these conversations happen.
Yeah, no, it's really magical that you guys have created these kinds of conversations. And
well, I also, you know, in your non-phenomenal appearance, I and all of us, I'm sure, appreciate that you are prepared to be a place where conversation happens.
It's my privilege.
It's really been good to have this conversation. There's so much depth and richness, and
thank you.
And it keeps opening. It keeps opening for more thinking, real thinking.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a few lines of thought. One was about this whole authenticity and how we experience ourselves. That's the whole question of embodiment. Then we're looking at power and powerlessness in our historical situation.
Yes. Maybe. Yeah, that would be.
Look, I mean, I just want to say, as much as I feel totally despondent, I don't think there's any other time in human history that I'd rather live than in now. I think that's
absolutely. Yes. Totally agree.
It's like super exciting. As much as you have these people with completely weird hair running the world into the ground.
Yeah.
It's still the most exciting times of all, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, yes. Yes, absolutely. Dominic, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining for the conversation. Yes. And join us next time. We'll let you know when it happens, when Dominic comes again. Next week, we're around here again, and Ingrid Hurwitz will come and talk to us about organization culture and teams, and specifically how we can use the Enneagram. I think the Enneagram is actually a very interesting way for you know, seeing the phenomenal self, this constructed self, just beginning to see some of them, because it's a slippery thing, isn't it? We think we're not phenomenal, and then the next moment we are phenomenal, and then we're trapped in the phenomenal self. And the same with organizational teams and cultures. So would love for you to come in. Lingiwe, you would love to share. We're closing the conversation. Lisa, I just want to check. Just hold on a second. Liesl, is there some other call that needs to jump up? And Dominic, do you need to run? Because we can, if any of you have time, then we stop the recording, close this, and you can.
I'm gonna stop the recording. I need to jump. I'll make you host, Krista, and then you guys can. I don't need the Zoom account, so that's fine.
Okay. And Dominic, if you need to run.
Let's stop the recording and do